The Everglades is the most famous wetland on Earth, a national treasure and point of pride for the United States. But the unanimity of its praise used to go in the opposite direction. Before man conquered the Everglades, the now treasured landscape was considered a wasteland, suitable only for the vermin that infested it, an impenetrable mix of dirt and water, with land too wet to farm and water too shallow to enjoy. For much of its history, the Everglades was something to be conquered, not cherished. An inhospitable swamp with the potential to become a subtropical paradise. Genesis 1:28 reads, "And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful, and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth." This God-given mission to subdue the earth and tame its wilderness was a fundamental part of the American mythos. This wretched wasteland that had been sentenced to extinction in favor of further expansion, a remarkable feat of nature that instead became a remarkable real estate opportunity, what they called the Empire of the Everglades. From the natives that first called the Everglades home, to those who so staunchly drained, developed, and eventually sought to restore this great landscape. This is the story of evolving ideals. How a people that once sought to bend the Everglades to their whim eventually grew to fight for its conservation. How man's faults and hubris permeated the progress we're so quick to champion. The progress that built the land that I and millions of others call home. The Everglades once covered 11,000 square miles of Florida, from the headwaters of the Kissimmee River through Lake Okeechobee all the way down to the Florida Bay, from modern-day Orlando to the Florida Keys. Today, this still remarkable marvel stands at less than half of its original size. Man, through remarkable effort and ingenuity, nearly destroyed the Florida Everglades, and eventually, through those same characteristics, sought to restore it. Even after the historian Frederick Jackson Turner proclaimed the death of the American frontier, the Everglades remained largely unknown to non-natives. This stubborn swampland was, in many ways, the last true American frontier. During an 1845 debate over Florida statehood, Congressman John Randolph of Virginia stated, "Florida, sir, is not worth buying. It is a land of swamps, of quagmires, of frogs and alligators and mosquitoes. A man, sir, would not immigrate to Florida. No, sir. No man would immigrate to Florida. No, not from hell itself." The landscape that used to make up all of South Florida has been described as wretched and mesmerizing, useless and mysterious, a bizarre concoction of disgust and admiration. As someone who is deeply invested in American history, I've always felt somewhat distant from it physically. Florida often doesn't feel as interwoven in the story of this country as other states do. Of course, you have the 13 former colonies that are associated with the Revolutionary period, the Great Plains in the far west that are associated with manifest destiny and westward expansion. Even the northern parts of Florida can be associated with the rest of the Confederate South during the Civil War, but that part of the state is both physically and culturally distant from the southern population centers like the one in which I grew up. I've often been jealous of other regions of the United States that seem to have more character, more natural beauty, more historical significance, more of everything that I felt Florida was lacking. But I was wrong, very wrong, in fact. It's easy to sit in my room and daydream about the breathtaking views of the great American West while not appreciating the natural marvels that are right outside my own window. Why? Because it's more subtle? Because its beauty and intricacy take time to understand, time that I have not been willing to give. And that is the goal of this project, to spend time in and learn the history of this great region. I invite you along for the journey to try to understand this bizarre contradiction of a place, this accident of the environment and its relationship to mankind. The Everglades are incredibly young. As Pangaea broke apart, North America snagged a piece of Northwest Africa, and while other parts of this continent underwent seismic changes that formed vast mountain ranges and rugged canyons, South Florida remained a barren seafloor, sitting there over millions of years, slowly building up sediment from shells and animal bones into a limestone base. This slow buildup, devoid of tectonic movement, is what produced the level ground we know as Florida today. As sea levels fell, it revealed a landmass similar to a savanna, with much of it at the same latitude as the Sahara Desert. It should have been dry, yet it was a peninsula, surrounded by water on three sides. Water that became clouds, clouds that became rain, and rain that would fundamentally alter the very foundation of the landmass, producing one of the most unique environments the Earth has ever known. And though rain was abundant, so was sunlight. It is common to feel waves of rainfall crashing down on you relentlessly, only to be replaced by the warm gaze of the sun mere moments later. Distinct wet and dry seasons set the stage for a strange mix of unique flora and fauna that flourished in both flood and drought. Florida's flat landscape made it so its abundant water didn't rush down roaring rivers, but instead trickled slowly yet surely through an invisible current calmly drifting southward, allowing the water to seep into that freshly minted land, where it would be retained and absorbed, becoming something entirely new. The same fall in sea level that brought Florida to the surface for the first time brought along with it the Bering Strait land bridge that connected Asia and North America. Paleo-Indians would make their way through this vast continent, encountering mammoths, mastodons, and giant bison, eventually traversing over 4,000 miles before coming across what we today call Florida. Florida's native tribes would, over time, develop a deep understanding of this strange environment, how to hunt its fantastic creatures, how to traverse its rivers of grass, and eventually how to evade the Spanish and later even American conquerors who set their eyes on the Everglades. This awe-inspiring swamp would prove to be treacherous for any outside invaders who sought to overcome it. While he commanded troops in South Florida, future President Zachary Taylor mused that he wouldn't trade a square foot of Michigan or Ohio for a square mile of Florida. The American soldiers who struggled through the Everglades during this country's wars against its native peoples described it as a hellish wasteland, made even more difficult by an enemy better acquainted with the challenging terrain. In his fantastic book, The Swamp, without which this video could not have been made, Michael Grunwald calls Florida's portion of the Indian Wars America's first Vietnam. Conventional tactics and strategies fell flat as the natives evaded the Americans at every turn, further frustrating the already disenchanted soldiers. There was nothing glorious about this campaign. The American government viewed the natives as less of a rival military power, but instead just another natural obstacle like the terrain or the weather that they needed to overcome. Despite the way in which it had been regarded, there were those who saw flashes of the state's future. Florida had the potential to become an agricultural juggernaut, a land of fertile soil, constant rain, and year-long sunshine that could yield an abundance of crops while the rest of the nation experienced winter. The only obstacle was, as it had been throughout this whole story, the water. The same factor that had driven the Spanish away, that had been the thorn in the side of American soldiers, that had given the natives the upper hand. No matter what, it would always present a problem. But as the American experiment drove frontiersmen to conquer the vast wilderness of this continent in the name of progress, new technologies emerged that made conquest more feasible. Much like the American West, it was the railroads that opened up Florida to the rest of the country. It is impossible to discuss the history of South Florida without discussing Henry Flagler, the Standard Oil tycoon whose investment in the Sunshine State laid the foundation for the rapid development that would occur in the 20th century. On a vacation to St. Augustine, Flagler noticed the region's potential, if only it were easier to access. By 1885, he had bought up 3 Florida railroads, forming the Florida East Coast Railway, which he would extend all the way down to Key West in a truly remarkable feat with 156 miles of track built mostly over water. He, of course, didn't do this out of the goodness of his heart. No, Flagler established multiple hotels along his railway stops. If you came to South Florida during the turn of the century, you were almost certainly putting money in Flagler's pockets. And come they did, as aspiring frontiersmen and pioneers journeyed down to the strange subtropical frontier. Ironically enough, as Henry Flagler's railroad brought the aspiring frontiersmen and pioneers down to the strange subtropical frontier, Florida began to change. The state's massive flocks of wading birds fell prey to a fashion trend where women wore bird plumes on their hats. Though a law protecting non-game birds was passed by the Florida legislature in 1901, who was going to enforce it in the lawless frontier that was the Everglades, that evasive land that had bewildered man for as long as man had tried to conquer it? The 1958 film Wind Across the Everglades stars Christopher Plummer as Walt Murdoch, an Audubon Society game warden in the early 1900s fighting against a group of bird poachers who make their riches off of the feather craze of the time, led by a shady character named Cottonmouth.
It was the turn of the century, opening up a new American frontier, South Florida. Here were the same kinds of adventurous men and women who had once been attracted to the West. Whether respectable ladies or free and easy dance hall girls, their hats displayed the feather craze that was sweeping the country.
The film was shot on location, right at the heart of the inhospitable conditions they sought to portray. As you can imagine, this was a challenging shoot, made even worse by director Nicholas Ray's drug use and erratic behavior that led to him being fired in the middle of production. It is a deeply strange film, a technicolor, psychedelic western that captures both the beauty and the terror of the Great Swamp, repeatedly portraying Florida as a sort of new frontier for those seeking adventure.
It's as if a river was a prairie, 50 miles across. The grass and the water run together.
3 million acres of unexplored frontier. I see a whole network of canals, bringing the wasteland into cultivation.
Beyond this river is an unexplored empire, all right? Now that I've seen it, I want to help keep it an empire. A sanctuary for wildlife.
What chance have you against the land pirates in Miami and the feather pirates in the Glades? You and I could be partners in the progress of South Florida.
Sir, I'm afraid that Progress and I never got along very well. Maybe that's what draws me into the Glades.
There are numerous long, lingering shots of wildlife immersed in their natural habitat, enveloped by eerie music. You feel Murdoch's simultaneous sense of fear and wonder that characterizes his early treks into that river of grass. Perhaps the most important of these shots are the ones of flying birds that filled up the sky. Ever since the earliest accounts of the Everglades, mankind marveled at the sheer quantity of wading birds that fed on the Everglades and colored its skies. just another part of the trance of the swamp that's captured so vividly in the film. The story of Wind Across the Everglades focuses primarily on the personal struggle between Murdoch and Cottonmouth. Murdoch eventually ventures out into the swamp in an attempt to arrest Cottonmouth, which no one else has even been willing to try. He's then captured by the hunters and spends a night with them drinking through a storm prior to his planned execution. Here, Murdoch fits in surprisingly well and is able to share laughs with this ragtag band of sketchy characters. Cottonmouth tells him he's just another part of the swamp's food chain.
Mr. Murdoch, you don't see me going into Miami messing up your town folks, do you?
No, Mr. Cottonmouth. But what about you messing up the glades?
Sure, I eat the birds. The birds eat the fish, and someday something will eat me, too.
He was born in the swamp, and he will die in the swamp. These two men that are at odds with each other find out that they actually share a lot in common. Murdoch laments the progress that man pushes with no regard for collateral damage, while Cottonmouth rejects the shackles of polite society. Both figures reject modernity. They find a bit of admiration for one another despite their struggle. The next day, Cottonmouth allows Murdoch to bring him into the authorities as long as he's able to navigate back to Miami while surviving the perils of the swamp. Made it his domain. He favored the animalistic simplicity of the Everglades, and reflective of that sentiment, the Everglades unfeelingly put him down by virtue of a snake bite. Despite its dreamlike quality, Wind Across the Everglades is actually loosely based on a true story of a Florida game warden named Guy Bradley, who was killed by feather poachers. This strange film is a clear reflection of the bizarre state and environment of turn-of-the-century Florida. A Florida that was about to rapidly change. At the height of the Industrial Revolution, the Army Corps of Engineers had been employed to push expansion on the American frontier, an arm of the federal government used to overcome any natural obstacles standing in the way of further American expansion. Now, decades later, they would set their sights on the last American frontier. And there's one man who, much like Cottonmouth, would try to rally the people behind him in an attempt to conquer the Everglades. Perhaps the most fascinating of all the men in Florida's history was a strange character by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, a man who carried the name of a great conqueror and that would attempt to continue that legacy in his own way. This Napoleon would fix his ambition not on Europe, but instead on that wretched swamp at the bottom of this great country. As a young man, Broward spent years working on a steamboat, moving up the ranks and eventually becoming a notable ship captain. During this time, he begins to flirt with politics, serving as the populist sheriff of his native Duval County. But that's not truly where he would make his name. Much like another young, boisterous politician in the making, Broward would derive his heroic image from the Spanish-American War. Before the United States had even officially declared war, Florida's Napoleon would lead unauthorized military expeditions in Cuba using one of his own ships called the Three Friends. These daring exploits only added to the image of a future conqueror. During a later conversation between then President Roosevelt and then Governor Broward, the president asked, "Have you still got the Three Friends? Well, you ought to be mighty proud of her. If it had not been for the Three Friends, you would not be governor now." To which Broward replied, "You ought to be proud of her yourself, because if it had not been for her, you would not be president." It is notable that these two successful politicians pushing territorial expansion had notable origin stories as war heroes that added to their legend. Broward became something of a hero, translating his accolades into a career in the Florida State House where he would push progressive policies that favored the common man. Though, of course, in keeping with his time, he excluded African Americans and later sought to have them expelled from the state. Though many had long mused of draining the Everglades and transforming Florida, including Broward's own predecessor who started the project, It was Florida's Napoleon who made it a central part of his campaign for governor. He pledged to lead Florida into the 20th century and reclaim the wetlands. Throughout all of my research, the word reclaim came up again and again, all throughout Broward's own rhetoric and the history that covers him. This word, of course, implies that that land belonged to them previously, that it had been lost or stolen. It was their divine right to subdue the land and take it under their dominion, after all. Napoleon Broward was a William Jennings Bryan-style Democrat, a social conservative and economic populist. He didn't curry favor with the major newspapers of his day. He played instead to the farmers, promising new lands for agriculture that put Florida at the forefront of the nation's sugar and fruit production. Broward called his vision for Florida's future the Empire of the Everglades, fitting perfectly into the country's narrative of muscular expansionism no matter the cost. But the Everglades didn't go without a fight. The stubborn, unforgiving ecosystem consistently fought back against drainage attempts as though it were a conscious being resisting subversion. Broward's attempts to tame the Great Swamp had mixed results at best. But despite the efficacy of his own efforts, his rhetoric and his promise to drain the Everglades set the stage for war between man and Mother Nature. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers would finally, through one of the most intricate water systems ever built, drain much of that stubborn, desired swampland. The state was finally ready for its transformation into the suburbs that would expand in population following the Second World War. A post-war paradise where there had only been a dreaded swamp. The swampland would now be rapidly transformed into picturesque post-war housing, full of shopping malls, golf courses, and beachside motels for the American family seeking a vacation to paradise. A brand new economic center for agriculture and tourism, built not from thin air, but from the damp, heavy water vapor South Florida calls oxygen. Half of the Everglades is gone, while the other half, the one which we cherish and venerate in the canon of the great American wilderness, is left fractured, wounded, a shell of its former glory, conquered in the name of progress. For the development of one of the most densely populated metro areas in the United States, the one in which I was raised, and like many others, I find myself conflicted. This sprawling suburbia that sits on one of the world's great wetlands is overcrowded, filled with elders, and increasingly expensive due both to its dreamlike quality, which brings so many to call it home, and the ever more apparent environmental ramifications of that development. Living. But your car insurance, your flood insurance, the things that become more expensive directly due to weather events are already massively hurting people's pockets. An area that continues to see growth as unprecedented as it is. We built one of the most densely populated urban areas in the country on land that was never meant to be developed. It is unsustainable. But that myth, that idea of exploration, is central to our self-concept. The Army Corps of Engineers, who had been monumental to the destruction of the Everglades, are now tasked with its restoration. As Americans, one of the most foundational aspects of our national myth is the spirit of exploration. The frontiersmen and pioneers that ventured throughout this great continent in search of the American dream, the individualistic cowboy who took the law into his own hands throughout the great American West. The cowboy is largely fictional, a product of children's stories and Hollywood. On the other hand, our conception of a frontiersman omits the violence they perpetrated against the Native Americans who already lived on the land we so often describe as vacant. There is something quite appealing about the promise of territorial expansion, something we clearly see demonstrated even in the politics of our modern day. The historian Frederick Jackson Turner had lamented the death of the American frontier as a tragedy, something that would stifle the American spirit of growth and exploration, leaving us a stagnant country with only the memories of what we used to be. But that romanticism leaves out the endless pain and suffering that was inflicted in the name of American expansion. But that myth, that idea of exploration, is central to our self-conception. JFK understood this better than almost any other political figure. He channeled the American spirit of adventure into his campaign. His use of the new frontier, this idea that we can revitalize that sentiment that drove us for so long. He channeled it into the space race.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
That line gets me every time, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. The United States willed itself towards the moon in the 1960s, pushing the boundaries of human achievement. And where did they choose to do this from? Where did the first lunar mission in the history of humanity launch from? Merritt Island, Florida, which a few decades prior had been a swamp, surrounded by a collection of small towns. The last earthly ground that Neil Armstrong stood upon before taking his one small step was the very ground that had been drained in favor of progress.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Hey everyone, I've had so much fun with these last few videos. I'm always trying to make every video better than the last. The thing is, these videos take a lot of work. I'm often working on them for weeks or even over a month at times, and frankly, the return on them through YouTube AdSense is rarely ever enough to justify the amount of time and effort that I put into them. I could do the normal YouTuber thing and ask you to support on Patreon, which is something I already do fairly often, but instead I wanted to make it a little more fun. I've decided to give away 10 free memberships to my Patreon that will each last for a month. This means you'll get access to all the benefits like early videos and having your name in the credits of the videos that I already provide. In addition to the current benefits, I'm going to try doing a podcast episode for each video that I upload, where I talk about the production process, the things that I had to leave out, the research that I did for the video, which I think could be a lot of fun. So if you want to see that, that'll be exclusively on Patreon. So if you're here early, try accessing that link and you can get a month for free on Patreon. If you can't support financially, which I totally understand, you can also help out the channel by just liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. Special thank you to our newest patrons, Luke, Othenio, Jordan Sweet, Brandon Gatewood, Quinn Murphy, and Zeke Glenn. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate all of you, and I will see you next time.